The top stories live from the Sky News City studio. Leaders gather in Cornwall for the start of the G7 summit and are expected to commit to providing 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines to the rest of the world. Protests, ambitions and expectations. Climate change will be high on the agenda, but what concrete action can be delivered?
And I'm live here at Tregunnon Castle outside St Ives with all the latest ahead of the first day of this G7 summit.
We'll ask what boost the summit will provide businesses in Cornwall, one of the most deprived economies in the United Kingdom. And we'll look at the state of post-Brexit brand Britain with a global focus on the UK this year. Also today, the UK economy grew quickly in April at the fastest rate since July last year, but it remains smaller than it was before the pandemic. Good morning, this is Ian King Live, an hour of business and economic news from the heart of the city. Now, the COVID pandemic, recovery from the biggest economic crisis in generations, the existential threat of climate change, foes from the east in the shape of China and Russia. These are the issues on the agenda at this year's G7 summit, and they are by any measure significant and challenging. Well, leaders of the big, wealthy liberal democracies are in Cornwall for the start of that summit today, and will kick off by committing to provide some 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines to the world. Well, our editor-at-large, Adam Bolton, is in St Ives, just down the road from Carbis Bay, where leaders from the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada and Japan, plus the EU, will sit down later on today. COVID and climate change will top that agenda. Adam, what's the mood down there like right now?
I think the mood is pretty optimistic, Ian, largely because this represents, in terms of international democratic diplomacy, if I can put it that way, a return to normal. There wasn't a meeting of the rich nations last year. That was partly because of COVID, but partly because Donald Trump, when he was president, didn't really like the G7. He preferred meeting with people he regarded as his equals, basically dictators of other countries. And there wasn't a meeting last year. He disrupted the previous ones, whereas now Joe Biden is coming to Europe very much with a message that America is back, that it wants to work with its allies and, where possible, lead them. And of course, that in the first part of the visit included the bilateral meetings yesterday with Boris Johnson, which seem to have gone fairly well. Then Biden is going to go on after this to meet the Queen and then go to a NATO summit before confronting Vladimir Putin in Russia. So the mood is we're back, if you like, to the normal which we knew before the 2016 disruptions. And there's to a certain extent a change of the guard happening here. This is going to be the last summit for Angela Merkel after 15 years of coming here. So I think there's also a little bit of the various leaders feeling their way as to where they're going to cooperate and where their confrontations are. And as you were saying, clearly within the European nations represented here, there are problems created by Brexit, particularly over that question of the Irish Protocol, although I think what we're going to see is that very much pushed in the margins, and they're going to go on to the things they really agree on, such as talking about the environment. They're going to the Eden Project for a grand dinner tonight, the Eden Project, which of course is very much an environmental centre in this country.
Adam, you mentioned just now the fact that Trump didn't really have a lot of time for the G7. To what extent is the G7 more important during this trip from Joe Biden compared with the NATO summit, which is coming up early next week, and of course his meeting with Vladimir Putin next Wednesday?
Well, I think all those meetings are important. This has a focus more on the economy, and as you know, in the preparatory meetings, the finance ministers moved towards having some sort of global coordination on corporation tax, particularly to get big tech companies contributing more to the exchequers of the various countries. But this is a reaffirmation, or they hope it will be a reaffirmation, of alliances with America very much as the senior partner. And that, I think, is important after, as I say, the disruption which there has been in global diplomacy over the last 4 years or so. It's also, to a certain extent, a test, the extent to which Joe Biden really is going to be prepared to work with his allies possibly meaning that America first has less of an emphasis. That I think will be something that Macron, Merkel, Johnson and the others will be trying to feel out today.
All right, Adam, thanks for that. Well, one man who'll know the intricacies of the diplomacy taking place on the Cornish coast over these next few days is the UK's former ambassador to the United States. That's Sir David Manning, and he joins me now. Sir David, very good morning to you. Boris Johnson doesn't want to talk about the special relationship anymore because he says it suggests we're too needy. What do you make of that?
Well, I sympathise with him in wanting to get away from the term special relationship, not because the relationship isn't special, but I think he says it makes us look needy. I always thought there was a risk. It made us seem a bit lazy about foreign policy, as though there was always the default position that if we got into trouble, we could just invoke the special relationship. So I think it is important to see the relationship in a wider way and to celebrate it for all sorts of reasons, not just the sort of special relationship tag that emerged after the Second World War.
Now, of course, when you were ambassador, Tony Blair and George Bush were the respective prime minister and president. There was clearly a degree of personal warmth between them, just as there was between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher all those years ago. To what extent does the personal warmth between the PM and the president actually count?
I think it does count. Personalities do matter. They matter in politics, they matter in history. And the fact that you can pick up the telephone to each other and you trust one another is just as important in political life as it is in personal life. But that's not the core of the special relationship. The special relationship is based on shared interests, shared values, and shared aspirations. And that must be why it's such a relief to Number 10, to the Prime Minister, to the current government, that they're welcoming Joe Biden to Britain this week and not Donald Trump. Because now at last we're back, as Adam Bolton was saying, to a situation where we can hope to cooperate on a common agenda rather than worry that, rather than be an opportunity, the American president is a threat to multilateralism, to the alliances and to the post-war international order. So I think it's obviously a moment of hope and opportunity. The personalities will matter, but there is a fundamental coincidence of interest.
Absolutely. I should just explain to David, while you've been speaking there, we've got pictures on air of Newquay Airport. These are live shots from Newquay, where we think Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, is about to emerge and walk down the steps of the aircraft. That is, I believe, her right now. So, David, you touched on the point that Adam was making there, the disruption to the G7, if you like, that was caused by Donald Trump. How important is this in terms of how it plays out in the United States? A lot of what's going on, how do you think it will be presented to a US audience?
Well, I think Joe Biden has to make the case domestically that it is much better to cooperate with allies than to adopt a policy of America First. The America First policy under Trump was seriously disruptive, and it was putting the post-war international order at serious risk, and was, I think...
Sorry, Sir David, to interrupt you. Just to say, we are looking at pictures. That is Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, arriving there at Newquay Airport and receiving a Guard of Honour. Sorry, Sir David, do carry on.
No, I was just saying that I think that it is undoubtedly the case that it was disruptive, and that the arrival of President Biden has given us a chance to reinvigorate, adapt, and build on the traditional transatlantic strengths. It's true bilaterally for Britain and the US, but it's going to be true in terms of the American president trying to forge a partnership between the EU, the US, the UK, and show that far from the narrative that certainly some of the Chinese have been pushing, that the democracies have had their day, actually we can work together, we can tackle the big international issues together, like the pandemic, like climate change, and that the future of the world is democratic, not autocratic.
What sort of tangible gains would you want to see from the G7 summit this year to prove that liberal Western democracy is still the best model for governance?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, and everybody's been saying this, is it's very important that we give a lead on the vaccines question. And the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is clear in all sorts of areas. But the situation that's emerging where the rich countries or the developed countries are profiting quickly from the vaccination and inoculation programs, and that the less developed countries are not, is unacceptable. Everybody's been saying we're none of us safe unless we're all safe. And here is a real opportunity for the G7 to give a lead, and indeed for the UK, and to put flesh on the bones of being global Britain.
What about the NATO summit coming up in Belgium next week? Obviously, there was a lot of friction under Trump's presidency in terms of the amount of money that a lot of NATO members were spending on defence, and in particular that sort of 2% of GDP target. Is that going to be an issue, do you think, this week?
I think it will be an issue in private. I think the Americans are serious about asking their NATO partners to pay their way, and personally I'm very sympathetic to that. It's not a new issue. It wasn't a Trump issue initially. We had been warned beforehand by the Biden administration, by Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of State for Defense in the United States, that NATO partners had to do better. And Biden is not going to change that view. He's going to insist that NATO does better. But I don't think he's going to make it the sort of confrontational, cantankerous issue that Trump made of it. On the contrary, I think what he will want to do at NATO is show that the United States is back, that we are working together in NATO, that this remains the anchor of Western security. And it's worth just saying, if we had got a re-elected Trump here, I think our conversation might have been, can NATO survive the experience?
Very good point on which to end this conversation. Sir David Manning, thanks very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Now, the eyes of the world may be on Cornwall this week, but many there may feel for too long it's been ignored by politicians closer to home. The county remains one of the poorest parts of the United Kingdom, with poor transport infrastructure and broadband holding back an economy that relies on tourism. That is, of course, highly seasonal and has been particularly hard hit by the COVID crisis. So what legacy will the G7 leave for the area, and will promises to build back better really mean anything in reality for Cornwall? Well, joining me now is Mark Duddridge. He's chair of Cornwall and Scilly Isles LEP, and he joins me now. Mark, very good morning to you. I mean, let me start with that question. What is the legacy of the G7 that you would like to see?
Yeah, good morning. You mentioned Build Back Better, and the Prime Minister and the President have already mentioned that, and your trailer makes it clear that that has to happen. And I think we have the opportunities to do so down here, particularly around the emergence of clean energy resources, georesources, and you saw guests for the G7 arrive at Newquay, which is going to be Europe's first spaceport. So what we really hope is the eyes of the world being on Cornwall at this time will not just attract the public investment, but certainly the private investment to make some of those new opportunities real. And today, I'm sorry, I'm in a little hotel room in Falmouth, but we have many global companies involved in building out floating offshore wind, energy companies, construction companies here in Falmouth today, talking about how the Celtic Sea gets developed as a rich source of energy for the UK. So that's, I think, the core of the legacy that we really expect to see over the next few years. And we've been delighted with the amount of attention that Cornwall's received over recent times on that.
Cornwall is, of course, one of the few English counties without motorway connectivity. I mean, that yes. is absolutely critical, surely, getting the A38 turned into a motorway.
I would beg to probably differ, actually. You mentioned about broadband. I think Cornwall has one of the best rural connectivity resources anywhere in Europe. And we're seeing, and we would like to see more and more infrastructure push towards that digital connectivity. We are really pleased to see Newquay Airport develop as both a spaceport and an airport. And we were talking to an American space company yesterday that is seeking to land their reusable spacecraft at Cornwall. So I think when we talk about infrastructure, it's really important to us that, yes, there is a physical need to get people to and from the county, and there's a lot of money being spent on the A30 and railway to that end. But I think many of the businesses here would talk a lot about digital connectivity and some of these things that's going to help us with this clean industrial revolution, which we hope Cornwall will be at the head of.
I mean, the clean industrial revolution of which you speak sounds very, very encouraging. But in the short term, you have this sort of vicious spiral of some of the highest housing costs in the land and some of the lowest wages. That is not a circle that you can break out of easily, is it?
No, and that is a really key important point. And whilst we are talking through the G7 to investors and to press and to politicians about the opportunity for investment, we are very, very mindful that Cornwall has had an economic structure which has meant that we haven't been able to offer the sort of pay levels. We know house prices are very high, and there's absolutely a housing squeeze going on at all levels within Cornwall. And I think we're also seeing the beginnings of a bite in terms of the availability of labour and skills. So we know there's some fundamental structural things that Cornwall needs to address. We are fortunate here, though. We have a very simple political structure here with the council. We have a very simple FE and HE environment here as well with the universities and the colleges. But we do know that those fundamental requirements of good living, of proper houses, proper homes for everybody, and security of that, and to be able to equip people of all ages with the skills that they need to do to develop the economy are really, really key. So we feel a little bit bipolar. Yes, we're talking a lot about the opportunities, but we also want to nail politicians' feet to the floor to say, actually, there's some real structural things which need to be addressed here. But I do think that the scale of the new industries growing out of Cornwall, as well as some of the traditional ones, really examining the value of what they offer and what they do and how they do, I think we have got the ingredients to change the structure of Cornwall's economy, maybe in 5-10 years timescale, but certainly the next few years could be quite tough.
Do you have the relevant skills base in Cornwall? I mean, I was looking at the demographics. I mean, Cornwall's population is older than the average of England and Wales as a whole. 30% of the population are aged over 60, and presumably most of them are retired.
Yeah, we have an older demographic, but we have got now 3 universities operating within Cornwall. We have a very simplified FE college system. We have an Institute of Technology being built here. Camborne School of Mines, for instance, is still active. We've got 95 mining companies operating around the world with the Centre of Intellectual Excellence behind it still based here. So we do think we have a fantastically deep marine and digital sector in terms of skill base, and we have a very well hidden but very advanced manufacturing base here. But we do know that we have got to make opportunities available for all. Rightly, there's a huge focus on the younger generation who've been very hit hard by COVID, but we know we do know that actually this investment in skills, investment of people has to happen from all ages, and that's something which Cornwall's been talking about for a while now. For the reasons you said, our demographic is more difficult, and one of the things we are talking to government is everybody.
OK, Mark Duddridge, appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
OK, thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, the G7 summit is always a big event for the host nation, a chance to show off part of the country with much of the global media spotlight for days on end. It's particularly important for the UK, which post-Brexit likes to sell itself to the world as global Britain. It's a chance to show it can still offer global leadership, a role that the government sees as a problem solver. Well, one big problem, of course, is climate change, and the UK will also host the COP26 Climate Summit later this year. So what is the state of brand Britain right now, and is it successfully being sold to the world? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Mary Oldham. She's Chief Strategy Officer at the branding agency VCCP. Mary, very good morning to you. How do you assess the health of brand Britain right now?
Morning, Ian. Well, actually, I think the coming together of Brexit and the pandemic has really brought us an opportunity in Britain. During the pandemic, we learned a lot about what we want from our brand. We want something that serves community. We want brands with purpose, brands that think about the planet. So I think Britain's in a unique position right now to rebuild ourselves in the image that people want for the moment. We're seeing a lot of consumers seeing this as a moment for resetting their lives. And so I think it is a fantastic opportunity to reset brand Britain.
How closely linked to brand Britain do you think Boris Johnson is? And is that an impediment given what a lot of Europeans and Americans seem to think of him?
I think he's obviously close because of where he is right now and his leadership through the pandemic. And the real opportunity for him is to seize the opportunity. I think he has done it with vaccines. He's shown that Britain can lead when it wants to. And now we need to take the people of Britain, the skills they have around food, around energy, as Mark spoke about, around community. And I think he has the opportunity to harness that. So he is intrinsically linked. and the opportunity is all his now, and now is the time to go for it.
All right, Marie, stay with us just a moment. We're looking at live pictures right now of another arrival at Newquay Airport, and as people will be able to tell from the lettering République Française and the tricolour tailgate, this is Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, shortly to appear from the aircraft. Marie, how unhelpful is it in terms of the selling of brand Britain that you've had the Duke and Duchess of Sussex giving all these interviews in the United States where they really do disparage the image of Britain and imply that we're all a bunch of racists?
Do you know, I think the issues they're bringing up around racism and around mental health are on the lips of consumers in Britain, particularly our youth audiences. We're listening every day to their point of view, particularly from schools, on the importance of their mental health and our mental health going forward. So I think, you know, we've got to remember that the consumers of Britain have their own voice, they have their own intelligence and their ability to make up their own minds. So they will listen to what Harry and Meghan have to say, but we only make judgments based on what we see in real life and what's affecting us. I don't think they're quite as interested in what may or may have happened in conversations in the palace. What they want to see is, are there more opportunities to get jobs? Are companies recruiting in a balanced way? Are we allowing people to set up their own businesses and to move forward? That's what people care about, really.
OK, just to interrupt you again, Marie, we're looking now at live pictures from Newquay Airport. This is the French President Emmanuel Macron about to appear at the top of the steps there, hopefully recovered from his nasty roughing up earlier this week when he was slapped by a member of the public on the campaign trail. Marie, how would you be marketing Britain right now? If you got the phone call from Whitehall this afternoon and said, right, we want you to lead a major campaign, what are the sort of things that you would be stressing?
The first thing I would stress is the entrepreneurial skills of the British people. You know, we've seen during the pandemic, we've adapted our businesses to do takeaways. We've taken on wholeheartedly hospitality in our homes through Airbnb. The staycations in Britain have allowed tourism to build. People are opening new restaurants, new bakeries. So I think we're bringing back craft skills around food, around clothing, around hospitality. And I would say the entrepreneurial spirit of Britain to get up and to create products that are great for the world we all want to live is the opportunity of now. I think Britain is ready to create the world that is coming and not live in the world of the past.
And what about all the great cultural exports of the UK over the years? I mean, the Beatles were sort of 50 odd years ago now. Have we got the cultural icons for that younger generation that you were talking about?
Of course, we only have to look at people like Billie Eilish and the people who are sweeping up the awards right now, the interesting stuff that Ellie Goulding is doing, the bands. So music is, I think it's really important for us to get music and theatre and cinema up and running so that we can bring the culture of Britain to life. But the culture of Britain has stood up, particularly in terms of the movies we've made and the content that's been shown on TV during the pandemic was second to none, as it always is. We have some of the best TV in the world. And now we need to concentrate on getting our music and our theatre and our art back up and running so that we can take that out to the world. I absolutely think this is a moment of opportunity.
And are there any countries in particular that you'd be targeting that we might not have previously thought about in the past as being a sort of key repository for selling brand Britain into?
Do you know, it's the world, to be honest. Britain, we don't have to even work really hard. Britain has always been the centre of tourism in the world. So I think we need to take ourselves to Asia, to China, to Japan, to the US. But we also need to make sure that we do not forget the incredibly strong relationships that exist with Europe. Because whilst Brexit's been tough, on a day-to-day basis, thousands of people in Britain have homes, friends, family in France, Spain, Italy. So we need to rebuild those connections. So everywhere is our target audience, I have to admit, and we mustn't forget, close to home first. We may have, left the EU, but we haven't left Europe. There's incredibly strong connections there.
How unhelpful is it to that end that we do seem at times to make life very difficult for people from countries like China and India to come and visit the United Kingdom?
We absolutely do. But, there's a balancing act that's got to be managed through this last year, which is really tough. And not all decisions are the right ones. And like I say, looking forward, what we've got to do is step forward, as we are with the vaccines, as everybody is with vaccines, step forward on a global platform.
Murray, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. As I speak, we are looking at pictures of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, just arriving at Newquay and receiving a Guard of Honour. We're expecting, after Emmanuel Macron, to be seeing the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, of course, a revered figure in the financial world for his very bold and brave leadership of the European Central Bank as he steered the Eurozone out of the global financial crisis. Just become the Italian Prime Minister, and great things are expected of him after years of stagnant underperformance from the Italian economy. So there we are. That is the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, arriving at what looks to be a fairly windy Newquay airport right now for the G7 summit. Now, we've just had the latest economic growth figures for the UK for April. They show the fastest growth rate since last summer as restrictions continue to be eased. Well, the UK economy grew by 2.3% in April. That was up from growth of 2.1% in March, and it represents the fastest rate of growth since July of last year, 2020. But the economy remains 3.7% below its pre-pandemic peak back at the start of last year. The services sector, which makes up the vast majority of the UK economy, grew particularly strongly by 3.4% as restrictions eased and more businesses could reopen in full. Well, let me tell you what's been going on in the markets. And Wall Street rallied last night despite news that US consumer price inflation hit 5% in May. The S&P 500 closed at a new all-time high. But as you can see, equity markets were mixed overnight in the Asia-Pacific region, with gains for Hong Kong, Sydney and Mumbai, but declines in Tokyo and in Shanghai. Well, in Europe, markets opened slightly to the upside at the opening a couple of hours ago. And here's the picture right now, all of them going into the weekend on a positive note. Here in London, that is also true for the FTSE 100. It's currently ahead by just over 0.5% in a pretty broad-based rally. As things stand, the FTSE's on its course for its best week since the week that ended on the 7th of May. The mining heavyweights are leading the gainers, but among the specific best blue-chip performers this morning, Halma, the testing and safety systems group, its shares ahead by more than 3% after yesterday's results, which were well received by investors. And Auto Trader, it also reported numbers yesterday, and its shares are currently ahead by just over 2%. Well, outside the FTSE, the asset management services provider Sanne is up by 11.5%, and that's after it entered takeover talks with Cinven after the private equity firm raised its potential offer for the business to £1.42 billion. And the recruitment firm Robert Walters, you'll recall seeing Robert Walters himself on this programme a number of times over the last 12 months. Well, his shares are up by some 4% this morning right now on news that results for the year will be better than expected. On the foreign exchange market, sterling is pretty becalmed this morning. There's actually a lot of statistical evidence, get this, to suggest that volatility in the FX markets drops during big football tournaments. The FTSE, the pound right now completely unchanged against the euro and barely changed against the US dollar right now. And the euro-dollar pair, again, looking pretty quiet right now. Maybe it is going to be all eyes on the football later on today. As for the oil price, well, that is pretty quiet too this morning. Crude actually dipped a bit right now, earlier on this morning on talk that Saudi Arabia done some of its recent production cuts. As you can see, it's in positive territory now. A barrel of Brent crude will currently cost you $72.71 a barrel. That is up 0.25%. Well, joining me now is Anna Stupnitska. She's head of global macro and investment strategy at Fidelity International. Anna, very good to see you this morning. Wall Street yesterday, it got the inflation number that it feared and the market went up. Why?
Well, this was another strong inflation print. And if you look at the composition of the drivers, it's still very much driven by the whole reopening dynamic. So on the supply side, there are still supply bottlenecks, particularly related to semiconductors, and that is feeding into used car prices. And on the demand side, the fiscal stimulus and the recovery in the jobs market is just supporting very strong demand for goods and services, and people are getting out and dining out and going on holidays. But again, if you look at this composition, these factors can potentially be transitory. And we know that the Fed has already said that this transitory inflation spike is going to fade towards the end of the year. And so when you look at the markets, and actually at the bond markets today, we've seen quite a big rally there. Now US yields, 10-year yields are at their lowest levels since March, at about 142, 143. And that means that the markets are potentially buying that transitory mantra. I would say we need to remain open-minded.
You raise a very, very good point there. I mean, we've been hearing for a while that bond markets are set to test the Federal Reserve's resolve in terms of continuing with its current ultra-loose monetary policy. You seem to think this gives a sort of pass to the Fed right now, then?
Yeah, exactly. And we heard from the ECB yesterday. They're happy to continue that extreme accommodation, and the Fed is not really under pressure because the markets are buying this view that those pressures are transitory. What we are looking at is some of these pressures, inflation pressures, potentially becoming more persistent if they affect inflation expectations. For example, we're seeing some of the wage rises, particularly in the lower paid occupations in leisure and hospitality. That's something that can affect expectations in those sectors, but also in some other sectors, and start pushing wages and inflation up on a more persistent basis. So yes, some of the factors might be transitory, but if they do affect inflation expectations, that can become a self-fulfilling loop, and that will feed into more persistent high inflation. So that's something we're watching very closely.
And a very brief word from you, please, on the GDP figures from the UK this morning. I mean, year-on-year comparisons are particularly meaningless given how awful April was last year. But I mean, are you reasonably encouraged by the number?
Yeah, this was a strong number, and you see the monthly momentum is picking up, very much shaping to be a good second quarter of this year. And I would say there were no huge surprises in the number. Everything is consistent with the reopening trade. And again, people getting out. So the services were very, very strong. And that's something that potentially, in combination with continued high inflation, can put pressure on the Bank of England to start withdrawing that recommendation. They have been much more hawkish or much less dovish than the ECB and the Fed, and they have a different reaction function. So I think they will be under pressure if we see a number of high inflation prints over the next few months. They will be under pressure to start talking about tapering and withdrawing accommodation.
All right, Anna, thanks for that. Good to see you again. Have a good weekend. Now, the very future of the world's stability and prosperity lies in cooperation between the UK and the United States. That was the typically understated claim from Downing Street as it announced a new Atlantic Charter, an updating of the relationship between the two countries. It comes despite tension because of the ongoing issues in Northern Ireland and hopes in government here that it can sign a trade deal with the world's biggest economy. So let's look now at trade and business links between the two. Joining me are Emmanuel Adam from British American Business, where he's the Executive Director in London, and Marjorie Chorlin. She's the Senior Vice President of European Affairs at the US Chamber of Commerce and Executive Director at the US-UK Business Council. Welcome to you both. Marjorie, let me start with you. What did you make of this new Atlantic Charter? Is this a bit of PR fluff, or is there something meaningful behind it?
Ian, thanks very much. I'm delighted to join you this morning, and of course to be with my great friend Emmanuel. Look, the Atlantic Charter, I think, is important for more than symbolic reasons. It is a deep reflection of the strong relationship between the US and Europe. Obviously, the challenges that were outlined to be addressed in the Charter now are very different than what we saw in the Charter 80 years ago, but practically speaking, the spirit is the same. The relationship is strong, the issues we have to tackle are great, and the partnership between the two countries is essential to tackle them.
Marjorie, is security more important than trade right now?
I don't know that you could say one aspect of the relationship is more important than the other. Of course, our trade and investment ties are extraordinarily strong. Together, we account for 2.8 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic, more than $1 trillion in two-way investment, extremely strong. At the same time, the challenges that we face in terms of security or geostrategic concerns are real. They shouldn't be understated. And it's the case that we've always had a multifaceted relationship, and there's nothing different to that today.
Well, Emmanuel, let me bring you in. Obviously, everyone wants to see a UK-US trade deal. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said only last month it could take some time. How optimistic are you that we'll get a breakthrough any time soon?
Well, I think we are optimistic that something will happen at some point within the next few years, but it doesn't necessarily have to be this year, to make it very short.
What do you think of the stumbling blocks?
Well, the stumbling blocks are, they're numerous. You look at a very broad, actually, the biggest stumbling block is that this is going to be a very comprehensive agreement. It will cover all different sectors that you can imagine. So you have to negotiate through, whether it be digital, agriculture, no matter what you can think of. And that will be the biggest stumbling block to go through all of these issues and to come to an agreement there.
It seemed under Donald Trump that America was going to push quite a hard line with the UK in terms of opening up its agriculture market and its food market. Do you get the sense that Joe Biden is going to press that agenda as hard?
You know what? I think Joe Biden doesn't press any agenda very hard right now because he clearly has a number of different priorities these days before he comes back to a negotiation. But when it comes to agriculture down the line, actually, we are quite optimistic and hopeful that a compromise can be found.
Marjorie, what about financial services? This is an area where you would think on the hot face of it, the UK and the US would have real opportunity to sort of get something going there.
I think broadly speaking, you're absolutely right, Ian. The fact is, both of our economies are heavily services dependent, and financial services is a critical competitive advantage for both of us. So I do see tremendous opportunity there. I will also agree with Emmanuel. This is not a tomorrow prospect. This is going to take some time. The challenges are real because it is a comprehensive negotiation, and it's a negotiation, and there are always challenges.
Marjorie, how unhelpful is it at the moment that US arrivals in the UK have to go into quarantine while most UK citizens can't even get to the US right now? We have to get an end to that logjam pretty quickly, don't we?
Yes, it's essential that we find a way very, very quickly to resume business and leisure travel between the US and the UK. It's essential to both of our economies. We have business executives that are frankly desperate to travel back and visit with their customers in the UK. And so we're hoping that this task force that's being set up will be able to accomplish that opening sooner rather than later.
Emmanuel, you're nodding in agreement there. We're told that it came up in discussion between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson yesterday. But again, the wording of what was discussed was pretty loose.
Well, you could probably say that from a business perspective, whether you're an airline or a business that is really keen to travel, it was rather disappointing to only have a task force. But what I would want to add here is that actually, when you look at it from a broader perspective, this was a success that a task force was set up because while the UK has at least never fully shut its borders, the US has been very silent on the issue. And in fact, as Marjorie pointed out, pretty much put a stop sign on its border for UK citizens. So this has been the first time that the US has officially acknowledged the issue as an issue and wants to take it forward in a bilateral way. And I think this is a success. Now we can only hope that a signal will be given very soon when air travel can resume between the UK and the US.
Marjorie, I've seen it reported in Forbes and elsewhere over the last 48 hours that the opening of the border to the UK is tied up somehow with the opening of borders with Mexico and Canada. Is that the talk in Washington?
Look, I think the broad issue of opening the borders to international travel is all related. Whether the opening of the border between the U.S. and UK is tied to Canada and Mexico, I think is I don't know that there is one discrete tie between them. But I think what you're finding is that the pressure to open borders between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico is strong because they are our largest trading partners on our borders. But the practical reality is, no matter where the borders lie, we have American business executives who are very eager to travel.
Well, we hope to welcome them to this country very soon. Marjorie, appreciate you joining me so early in the morning your time. And Emmanuel, good to talk to you too. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Now, much has changed since the G7 properly got going in the mid-1970s. There are now many other economies that eclipse the size of many of the G7's members, not least because of the rapid development of China. Well, there's been huge technological change, globalisation and the liberalisation of world trade, and of course the fall of the Berlin Wall, the crises of 9/11, the 2008 crash and COVID. Well, the G7 represents much less of the economy than it did, but these countries still have vast wealth, influence and power. So let's put them into economic context now with the economist and author Linda Yueh. Linda, good to see you this morning. When the G7 started, it represented 80% of global GDP. It's down to less than half of that now. Does it still have relevance in this day and age?
I think it still has relevance. But of course, the reason why that countries have been invited to observe via video link, so I think this is Korea, India, South Africa. This is to try and broaden the economic reach of the G7. But where I think the G7 does have relevance is that we actually live in a world, because of tensions between the US and China, as well as other tensions, it's quite difficult to find a global consensus on a number of issues. And so what the G7 has done, you see that in the global tax proposal, is that they're taking what's called a plurilateral approach. So in other words, a group of countries comes up with a proposal, and then they use that to build momentum and buy-in and try and find a global consensus on issues that affect a lot of economies. And I think that's potentially where the G7 has influence because of the changed circumstance, really, in the 21st century.
I mean, obviously, during the financial crisis, it quickly became apparent that the G7 on its own wasn't going to be big enough to steer the global economy off the rocks. That was why the Bush administration instigated the first meeting of the G20. Is that now slightly more important than the G7?
I think the G20 is important because the coverage of, who would, sign up to and get, buy-in is much broader than the G7. But the G20 hasn't really come up with, agreements to further, say, multilateral rules around data. We see that as a G7 focus. They have struggled to further, global trade rules. And of course, that goes beyond the G20. But what it represents is that you have a group of countries, because of geoeconomic tensions, just can't quite come to an agreement. And that's why you see the G7 really gaining in prominence again. And if you look at some of the topics that they're hoping to tackle, it's really to find shared interests and then try to find proposals on everything from pandemic preparedness to global environmental issues to tax, which I've already mentioned, and then creating sort of a board to manage data and technology. So this looks like it's a different kind of global alliance where you start with a small group of countries and then you try and get buy-in. But of course, Ian, it's very difficult. On the global tax proposal, for instance, it now needs to go from the G7 finance ministers to the G20 next month. And then the OECD's 139 countries need to agree on it. So there's no guarantee whatever the G7 comes up with will actually satisfy what the rest of the world would want.
One of the things that we've heard a lot in this programme already, Linda, is that this represents a real opportunity, this summit, for the Western liberal democracies to prove that they have the best means of advancing development right across the globe compared with countries like China and Russia and so forth. Are we investing too much hope in it?
Well, that was certainly the focus of the President Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister's meeting yesterday, the updated Atlantic Charter. There's quite a lot of focus on promoting democracy, security alliances. And I think at the G7, they may well find common ground with other G7 countries on that as well. So, I mean, this is the other big strand, which is the US and the Chinese rivalry over lots and lots of issues. But of course, quite a bit of it is over who gets to set global rules. And the US had gone it alone the previous 4 years and I think struggled to make a lasting impact. And so the shift is to try now bring alliances, for instance, the G7, which also includes Japan, and try and use that as a way of promoting the kind of rules-based system, the kind of market-based regulations that quite a lot of economies, the U.S. would and the U.K. and others would like to see, versus say a more Chinese system or a system driven by other values. So I do think that is a strand that's coming through. And if the U.S. were to build this alliance, and this is also where you hear comments like when you invite other democracies like Korea and India, then what you're getting at is a kind of alliance of democracies, a G10.
Okay, Linda, so sorry, we've got to move on. Good to talk to you again. Thank you. Well, from the world economy back to the Cornish economy now. There is bound to be plenty of coffee drunk at a big international summit, and at the G7 it will be served from cups made by the local eco company Circular & Co. Each one is made from 6 single-use paper cups, and following a partnership with Starbucks, the company has moved manufacturing to the UK. So how much of a boost will the G7 give the company and others like it in the area? Well, joining me now is the founder and CEO of Circular & Co, Dan Dicker. He joins me live from Perranporth. Dan, very good morning to you. It was all quite hush-hush, your cups getting used at the summit. You were told by a journalist, I believe.
We literally got a call saying, congratulations, have you got a comment? And we were like, on what? So it was good to, it was just nice we found out. But yeah, it was a bit hush-hush.
And how many have you produced for the summit?
900. So it's, I think it's for all the delegates and then all the press.
And how many a year would you produce in normal circumstances?
Oh, a million plus. So they're sold sort of globally around the world. But as you pointed out, production is now down here in Cornwall, just down the road in St Austell. And actually all the majority of the material contents that are all recycled materials are from Cornwall as well. So we actually not only make the cup from recycled single-use paper cups, but also from local ice cream, sort of recycled ice cream tubs from local companies as well. So it's a very regionalised sort of circular product.
Now, you were previously a designer at Dyson before you set up this business in 2003. What made you do it?
Well, I wanted to desperately move to the coast, and I wanted to do my own mini Dyson. And there was 2 areas actually that I was a bit frustrated with, because back then it was 18 years ago, I knew technically we could start making products out of recycled materials. And actually the catalyst was really when I moved to Cornwall and saw what happens when you don't do that, i.e. the pollution and the beach waste. And that was the catalyst really to make me think, come on, I know we can do it. So let's start doing it. And I think when you're a small business, you've got that ability to take on and disrupt and have a go at kind of things.
And what did you use as seed capital? How did the funding come to get going in the first place?
My mum.
Really?
She lent me I always remember she lent me the first £94 to order my first bit of stock to make some product. So there you go. Thanks, Mum.
Well, I hope you paid her back several times over, Dan.
Well, do you know what? I'm not sure I did. I think I've paid her back with stress probably over the years, but there you go.
So what about pricing? I mean, we keep hearing that people are prepared to pay up for sustainable products, but is that actually the case in the harsh reality of life?
I think you're right. When you do polls, it's interesting. When you do polls, people say, yeah, I am more willing to pay. But I think the interesting point is they shouldn't be. They shouldn't need to. We've been doing products out of recycled materials for a long, long time, not just for us, but for other big global brands, and actually it doesn't cost more and it shouldn't cost more. So I think that's from an industry perspective, we've got to make sure that happens. So it's not a conscious decision for people. They just, if you want to buy some wellies, you go out and buy the wellies you want that tick everything that you want, but they are in their nature, they are already designed in a circular way. So when we mean circular, we mean it's made from waste materials as much as it can. It's designed for longevity. So we keep extending the life of all the resources and materials we're using. And then at the end of its life, it's got to be designed for recyclability. That's the key bit, so that you can then keep reusing it.
All right, Dan, we've got to leave it there. Great to talk to you this morning, and congratulations on supplying the G7.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Ian.
Cheers. Now, still to come on Ian King Live, I'll be speaking to the chief executive of the parent company of the buy now, pay later provider, ClearPay. Don't go away. Welcome back. Now let's take a quick breather from the G7 and look at an increasingly important but controversial part of the UK retail landscape. So-called buy now, pay later services allow people to spread the cost of a purchase over a few months without any interest. But it's attracted criticism as a slippery slope into debt, and it will be regulated soon here in the UK with an announcement expected imminently. Well, ClearPay is one of the major players. It's owned by the Australian company Afterpay, and it's the major sponsor of London Fashion Week, which starts today. Well, joining me now, the founder and chief executive of Afterpay, Nick Molnar. Nick, very good to talk to you right now, and thanks for, well, it's not that late, for joining us in Sydney right now. Now, look, first question, why are you branded in this country as ClearPay, whereas everywhere else in the world you're Afterpay?
Yeah, so we made an acquisition in the UK about 2 years ago to launch into the market under the brand ClearPay. So, in the UK and all throughout Europe, we're, really privileged to be called ClearPay, and, to achieve 2 million consumers in the UK market just in 2 short years has been a remarkable achievement for us. And as you mentioned before, really excited about London Fashion Week launching today.
Why did you partner with London Fashion Week? Why was that so important to you?
Yeah, fashion's been in our DNA from the day that we started the organisation. They've been, the industry that supported us from the start. So to be able to invest, in the industry through the good times and the more challenging times to really get behind the market. We're seeing activations that we've brought to life that go live and can take our customers to the front page or front row of Fashion Week on the King's Road, which it's an amazing activation and can't wait to see everyone getting out there. But we just can't wait to bring our customer base to the surface and really invest in the UK fashion market.
So how concerned are you at the prospect of tougher regulation in the UK?
Yeah, look, from day one, it's really unique in terms of how we built our product and doing it fundamentally different from traditional finance providers. We never charge interest for any of our service, so we're very different from other providers in the space. And we've always been very pro-regulation from day one, to build a framework that's fit for purpose, a product that operates very differently by locking out consumers from their account the moment they're late on one instalment payment, so they can never revolve in debt, has been a really exciting initiative for us. And it's been received by customers really well, just given the fact that we are different and we've got the customer's best interests at heart.
Now, you're a massive company. I think you're the 16th largest on the ASX index, nearly 30 billion Aussie dollars. Apparently, you may list in the US. What's the thinking there?
Yeah, look, over the past, 2-3 years, as we've begun to go international, launching in the US, then launching in the UK, and now live in Spain, Italy, and France as well, we've attracted some pretty significant institutional investors overseas. So from our perspective, we're seeing 50% of our transaction volume now, happen in the US and in Europe. And so to, follow our retailers globally and similarly look at how we expand our institutional investor base, given how our business has fundamentally changed its landscape since we founded the company in Australia just 5 years ago. It makes sense for us to explore all of the right opportunities that are commercially advantageous for our business.
Now, one of your biggest shareholders, of course, is Tencent, the Chinese fintech giant. Might that be a bit of a stumbling block to a US listing?
Yeah, so Tencent bought, a shareholding within Afterpay just on market like any other investor would. And so, while they've been very supportive of us, they are just a shareholder of ours. And there's a lot of learnings of how, great fintech organizations around the world have scaled very quickly. And, ClearPay and Afterpay is one of those. So to be able to apply some, we'll have partners that can give us insights and, really push us to be our best selves. It's great to have them around and for them watching over our shoulder and watching our business.
Well, very briefly, Klarna have just completed another funding rise valued at $45 billion. Are you worried about them as a competitor?
Look, I just think it says how exciting the space is. We are fundamentally different from other players in the market. We don't ever charge interest. So we're not trying to upsell a line of credit. And that's been what's been so well received from
we're out of time.
Base.
Appreciate you joining me. Thank you. All the best. Adam Bolton's next. Stay tuned. Cheerio.